At the end of the exam period, when the grades results come out for each of the exams, the moderators tend to write a report which gives us a little bit of guidance as to how all students across the country did on the individual questions on the exam paper. And I thought it'd be a useful exercise to have a look at this examiner's report from 2017, just to kind of have a look at the kind of things that the examiner suggested students need to think about in terms of future exams. So here's an overview of what the examiner said, with the yellow bits, basically they're just the bits I've highlighted. So he talks about the correlation or the link between content, context and command words was limited in this particular exam. Okay, so there are certain words that the examiner uses within the exam, such as discuss or explain or describe. And these were the words that not everybody who sat the exam seemed to understand what the question was asking for, because they didn't really understand what was meant by discuss. They didn't know what was meant by explain or identify, which meant they weren't able to work out how many points were awarded for the answer to the question, because they didn't really understand what they were being asked. So there is on this unit pre-release material. And one of the things that the examiner suggested here was that students didn't seem to be entirely familiar with the pre-release material. So the context of this was Progress Bike Safe, but students didn't seem to have read it, or if they had read it, they didn't seem to fully understand what it was about the case study that they needed to understand. They didn't seem to fully be familiar with what kind of questions they were likely to be asked, because they hadn't looked at the bullet points on the bottom of the pre-release material. Okay? So the key message here is to read the case study and understand it. So this is some of the questions from section A, and you can see that this relates to this specific case study. The learner database, we've looked at these kind of questions previously. It shows you an excerpt from a database and it asks you a question, and some of the questions were just identify the information style. And then why is this information style being used? But if we can see, the examiner is telling us here that in the first part of this question, most candidates did okay. They were able to say it's number or it's numerical. And part two of the question required some explanation as to why this style had been used. And many candidates were able to do that and were able to give some choice and explain the information styles. But some of the explanations were limited. And some candidates were able to maybe explain more than maybe just one, because it was a 3-mark question. But not all candidates were able to do that. So most people got 1 mark for this, but most students only got 1 mark for this. They missed out on 2 marks on this question because they didn't really understand numerical information style. Okay, so now looking at question 2. So it tells us that the company are concerned about the security of the data for learner records, okay, people who are learning how to ride motorbikes. And the question's about tiered levels of access, and for 4 marks you were, to explain how tiered levels of access can be used to maintain the security of the learner database. So it's a 4-mark question. And again, we can see the examiner is telling us that the majority of responses to this question, they were too vague. They were too generic. They didn't relate to the case study. And it seemed to be lacking any real understanding of the case study and what tiers of access are and how they are used. So, the examiner tells us here that in this case study, the groups of people who have access to the database were defined, okay? So again, unfamiliarity with the case study. Candidates must ensure when answering the questions that they directly relate to the case study. And most candidates only picked up 50% of the marks on this question, and that was mainly because they gave a general response, okay? So to access all marks, it tells us at the bottom here that the answers need to be specifically related to and specifically applied to the examples from the case study. Okay, so this question was a large question, and it was to do with the Data Protection Act. So these discuss questions, as we've seen before, these are quite often 8-mark, 10-mark questions. They're often questions that require you to give some understanding of maybe, whatever the topic is, good points, bad points, advantages, disadvantages. In this case, it's asking us to talk about the Data Protection Act and to discuss the actions that should be taken so that the company can comply with the law. And there is some indicative content here. So these are the kind of things the examiner, was expecting candidates who sat this exam to be writing as part of their answers. So the comments from the examiner here, okay? They were awarded marks based on the level of detail and the application of their response, again, to the case study, okay? So they were looking for, as you can see in yellow here, correct use of technical terms. And you see this also in Unit 1. There is an expectation that you understand the technical terminology and that you use the technical terminology. Okay, so no credit was gained if you just wrote down the 8 principles of the Data Protection Act, okay? But if you wrote down those 8 principles and then explained what you could do to comply with them, then you would have picked up some marks, okay? So this is clearly a case of not reading and understanding the question. Discuss the actions, okay? That's the question. What should Progress Bike Safe do to comply? Just regurgitating the law isn't an answer to the question, okay? Many candidates were able to provide at least one action that could be taken. The most popular action was around security, and this basically, with some explanation, would have got you kind of around middle marks. But middle marks is not great on a 10-mark question. We need to be looking at top marks, or as close to top marks as we can on these questions, because that's going to be the difference between a pass and a merit, or a merit and a distinction. Okay, so to reach the highest mark band, candidates needed to provide more than one action. Again, it's defined in the question. What are the actions that need to be taken? Okay, and then these actions need to be applied to the scenario in the case study with examples. Okay, so it's clear that we not only need to understand the content, but we also need to understand the case study and how we can apply the content to the case study. Okay, so the next question is about learner records. Database is backed up to a CD at the end of every day. Identify some other storage device that could have been used instead with some justification. Now, again, it's a 5-mark question. You're only going to get 1 mark for identifying a device. So the other marks are all to do with, well, why would you use that? Okay, so if you just wrote USB, that's not a device. That's a connectivity. It's a port. Okay, it's the mechanism by which the device itself is connected to the computer. It's the bus. It's not the memory stick. So if you'd have said USB, you wouldn't have got any marks. If you'd have said USB memory stick or USB external drive or something like that, that would have been fine. And again, if you'd have said hard drive or solid state disk or memory stick, but you didn't say that it was external or portable or removable, then you wouldn't have got anything much for that either. Okay? So what does the examiner say? He says, many candidates provided vague responses. USB and hard drive were given as possible answers. Too vague, not specific enough, okay? And candidates who did identify a storage device were then able to, accurately go on to explain why that was a good option. Okay, so if candidates sort of said you can take these off site, which makes it more safe, they're more robust than a CD, they can be written over and edited, they're mutable, unlike CDs, then that would have given you marks. Also, now the next question talks about emails. It says the case study sends emails to its part-time staff to inform them of dates of future courses. Discuss the benefits and limitations. Okay, so the question is clearly a discussion question. You can see again, it's a 10-mark question. And it's asking for benefits and limitations. If you just think about this question logically, 5 benefits, 5 limitations, 10 marks. Okay, or if you'd have said 6 benefits and 4 limitations. Okay, so you need to be thinking about the structure of the answer to these kind of big questions and where you're going to pick up 10 marks. Okay, so the examiner is telling us here that the focus of the question was on benefits and limitations of using email, and to be awarded a mark in the middle, you needed to provide benefits and limitations. Okay, many candidates were able to describe the benefits of using email, and so they picked up marks generally, okay on there. And the level of detail provided was the difference between whether you landed in the middle or you got the top marks for this. Okay, so you need, again, similar to the other question, you needed to have considered more than one benefit and more than one limitation to be looking at more than, lower marks on this question. And those who did best on this were those that gave specific examples relating, again, to the case study. Okay? So there's an example here of an answer to a question that a student wrote. This has been scanned and provided by the exam board so we can have a look at it. And we can see here the candidate has written that emails are quick. They are sent out using an active internet connection. The cost of sending an email is free in comparison to written forms of communication, and that's it. And he started to say a limitation includes and then written nothing. So 1 mark. And the reason it's only worth 1 mark is because there's only one advantage. And it's unstructured, it's basic, there's limited evidence of relevant examples used. Whereas a high-level answer would have included several benefits and limitations. A good attempt at discussing these was expressed clearly and fluently. Examples are given and the points made are substantiated by these examples. All the examples needed to be in the context of the case study, and the candidate needed to provide example of the data that would need to be encrypted and why. Okay, so you're losing marks here, not giving examples and not really explaining your answers as part of your discussion.